Perfect.
Great. Okay, well, we'll start just after 1.
That's good. Do you guys have any plans for moving into in-person seminars anytime soon? I guess not with the new strain over the past week, but there was a glimmer of it potentially happening at some stage.
I know. We haven't got any plans really. So
yeah.
But maybe. Although there do seem to be in-person conferences being planned for next year.
Yeah.
So, Natalie Nichols has asked if you're from the Dick School of Veterinary Sciences in Edinburgh.
I am. Yes, that's where I'm sitting right now, actually, down in the Easterbush campus, which is south of Edinburgh.
So to everybody who's just joined, thanks for coming, and we're just gonna wait a few more minutes for some other people to join. I think we've got quite a few who've joining, but I know with Zoom, people tend to just join straight away, so you don't have to move buildings. I'm guessing, Lindsay, did you just celebrate Thanksgiving as well?
I did, yes. Thursday last week, although it was quite strange because obviously it's not a holiday, so we ate at like 6 in the evening instead of 2 o'clock, which is usually when Americans eat Thanksgiving. But it was really nice. Yeah. Nice to not be, just the 2 of us for Thanksgiving. Last year it was kind of lockdown time, so it was nice to have a couple people around before things get locked down potentially again.
Yeah, it's nice to see people.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll get started. I know there's more people joining, but if you missed my introduction, that's probably not the worst thing. But I just wanted to say thank you, Lindsay, for coming and speaking to us today. So today's seminar is entitled Health Co-Benefits of Organic Farming, and it's led by Dr. Lindsay Jaacks. And Lindsay is a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow and Chancellor's Fellow, Global Challenges at the University of Edinburgh. I think that's right, maybe a bit wrong.
Yeah.
But Lindsay could correct me after this. And Lindsay joined the University of Edinburgh in 2020, following her position at Harvard University as an assistant professor of global health, where she established and led a research team working on global non-communicable diseases and developed the obesity transition framework. So really excited for Lindsay's talk today. And we should have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, which would be great. So I'll pass over to Lindsay.
Thanks so much, John. It really is a pleasure to be here today. And as I was reading about the unit, I felt even more excited because I'm a public health researcher at heart. And in fact, my entire career up until I moved to Scotland was actually in schools of public health. But as you might guess from my talk title, I'm no longer in a school of public health. I'm actually at a vet school down here in the Easterbush campus at the University of Edinburgh, and working very much on agriculture and food security. And I really kind of took that leap of faith into the agriculture world as a public health scientist, because I really wanted to kind of work a bit more on one of the major pillars of health and well-being, and that is food. And so I have two goals for the next 40 minutes or so, hoping to leave lots of time for questions. The first is kind of just to provide some information on issues around pesticide use in agriculture and one potential solution to that, which is organic farming. And then second, I'm going to share an update regarding a study that a global team of researchers across a very wide range of disciplines, including Peter Craig, that we're conducting together with the government of India to understand what are kind of the population health benefits of large-scale transitions to organic farming. And that project is being done in India. So I'm going to share a little snippet of a video that the government has put together, so you kind of have a feel of what that program looks like on the ground, and talk about some of our pilot results for that study and our plans for the upcoming year. So just to kick us off with a really basic question, because I recognize, being from a school of public health, that these things are not as well known for people who kind of work in public health and in medicine, actually. So what are pesticides? I've included the definition from the U.S. National Institutes of Environmental Health up on the slide here. But really, pesticides, when I think about them, are the only chemicals that we know are toxic. They're designed to kill things that we are intentionally releasing into the environment. And the reason that they are released, of course, is largely within agriculture in order to achieve food security, though I'll talk a bit more about what the role of pesticides really is in achieving food security. But they're also, widely used in other parts of life, and I'll talk about our different routes of exposures a little bit later on. But in the UK, for example, pesticides like Roundup, which contains glyphosate, are they're used on golf courses, football pitches, gardens, parks, playgrounds. If you're walking down, if you look at train tracks or sidewalks, they've often been sprayed with this to kill the grass or weeds that might come up. So they're really kind of more widely used, I think, than people are aware of. And in many parts of the developing world, like India, where we are conducting our research, pesticides are also used for control of mosquitoes in order to prevent vector-borne diseases. And of course, lots of pesticides actually have their origin not in agriculture even, or in these kind of recreational uses or vector control, but actually in war. So for example, one of the most widely used herbicides today, aside from glyphosate, which is in Roundup, but there's another herbicide known as 2,4-D. And that was one of the major components of Agent Orange, which of course was developed as part of the Vietnam War and released by the U.S. government in rural areas in order to cause, major food insecurity in that area. But the subsequent research that's been done, both by the Vietnamese government, but also of U.S. Army vets who have kind of come back from having exposure to that herbicide, have shown that it increases the risk of cancer. They also identified a pretty significant increase in birth defects among babies in rural Vietnam. And so it's kind of studies like that that really early on actually suggested that these chemicals were not only toxic for the target organisms, but also for humans. But back to kind of focusing on agriculture, we're really only just starting to uncover how much pesticide exposure we are getting globally. So this was a very recent study published this year that actually quantified for the first time global pesticide pollution on agricultural land. And they defined here land that was at risk of pesticide pollution if pesticide residues in the environment exceeded the no effect concentration. And you can see in this map that a lot of samples met that criteria, which is really not even a toxicological criteria, a human, toxicology criteria. So lots of areas just at very high risk of pesticide pollution. And you can see in particular, actually, that Europe is quite dark red in this. And in Europe, 62% of agricultural land in this study was found to be at high risk of pesticide pollution. So it's a really pervasive exposure around the world, including in the UK, Europe, and other high-income countries, as well as in many developing countries. And this is really just a kind of example for people who aren't familiar with the application of pesticides from the UK in terms of how are these applied to a common crop like wheat that's being grown for bread and other flour-based products, as well as animal feed. And in the UK, DEFRA publishes routine reports on the use of pesticides on different crops. And the latest report for wheat indicated that on average, farmers are applying 3 fungicide sprays, 3 herbicide sprays, with the #1 herbicide being used by far, glyphosate, which is in Roundup that I showed on the previous slide, and 1 insecticide spray. And you can see kind of the calendar throughout the year of when these different pesticides are being applied. So it's really, not just 1 spray, but multiple sprays. That same report, if you look at potatoes, for example, they're sprayed more than 30 times in a given season. So really high levels of pesticide exposure. And, this isn't really the only way. And it's kind of, I think of the situation of this really high levels of pesticide use and pesticide pollution globally as being very similar actually to things like COVID or AMR, where we have kind of created conditions that are conducive to outbreaks. In this case, not, bacterial outbreaks or viral outbreaks, but insect or other pest outbreaks, plant diseases, but also weeds and fungus infections. And the reason for this primarily is that we have created monocropping systems. So large-scale, genetically uniform fields like the one that's shown here, but which are really commonplace all over the world now as a result of the Green Revolution. They're really, prime territory for the proliferation of crop diseases and pests. And, similar to what we see with COVID-19, globalization means that these pests are introduced very quickly across our globalized food system. So an example of this is fall armyworm. Fall armyworm is actually from Central America, but it is now spreading all over the world and impacting crops. I was in Nepal in January of last year, and farmers were talking about how this is a major issue affecting their tomato crops, which is their livelihoods. That is a completely new pest introduced from Central America through globalized food systems. So a major issue. And this also intersects with climate change. So again, we're seeing with vector-borne diseases and how the range of those diseases is expanding as climates get wetter and warmer globally. We're seeing the same thing with not just vector-borne diseases, but also pests that impact food crops. And then finally, the indiscriminate overuse of pesticides, very similar to the overuse of broad spectrum antibiotics, is resulting in pests that are immune to the effects of pesticides. And these pesticides don't just kill the pests, they tend to kill all insects, so the beneficial insects and the pests. And actually, much like we're learning with microbiomes, a lot of insects are actually really beneficial. And we're only just now starting to understand that underlying ecology. And so when you take a broad spectrum insecticide, like many of the neonicotinoids that are in use, and kill all of the insects, that actually can kind of get rid of naturally occurring predatory insects that would have helped you with the pest in the first place. So we've really created the conditions that are conducive to outbreaks. So, if the previous study I mentioned on pesticide pollution was testing environmental samples, but what about the food supply? So DEFRA also does pesticide residue testing on food samples that are collected from across the UK, pretty small sample of foods that are tested every year. But you can see from this that many of those samples contain multiple residues, and a handful of them are above the maximum residue limit. In fact, it's about, when we just kind of look at the ones that have more than one type of pesticide residue detected, it's about 40% of bread samples, with a lot of the pesticide residues detected in that glyphosate, which is that herbicide that I mentioned, is sprayed multiple times throughout the growing season. 60% of apples, 80% of grapes, and 90% of strawberry samples have more than one type of pesticide residue detected. And I think it's important to note that these, when we say, for example, the maximum residue limit, that's not actually a human toxicological parameter. It's not like that's the maximum level, beyond which you start to see really adverse effects in terms of human toxicology. But it's actually just the level that would be expected if farmers followed the direction on the pesticide bottle and, kind of adhered to the agricultural practices that are mentioned on that bottle. And so those studies are really, that kind of inform the directions on the bottle, are very small scale farm studies in which the pesticides are applied to a very particular crop, and they're done by industry. And so there's clearly, a lot more research that needs to be done in terms of linking up agriculture and setting these types of residue limits and public health outcomes. So some organizations such as PAN, which is a Pesticide Action Network here in the UK, a large kind of third sector organization, they come out with lists every year based on that DEFRA data that I showed in the previous slide to come up with a Dirty Dozen list. So these are the 12 food products that have the greatest proportion of samples that have more than one pesticide residue detected on them. And so you can see here that it tends to be kind of in the US, but also over here, as I've started following the Dirty Dozen list for the UK, it tends to be berries and kind of the prepackaged salads like kale, spinach, herbs, these types of soft leaf vegetables and berries that tend to be quite high. Interestingly, in the UK, the citrus fruits also tend to be high, which is a bit different than the US sample. But you can always, if you just want a resource for what are the foods that tend to be high, and therefore the foods that you might want to try to buy organic if it's available, PAN comes out with this list every year, though it does tend to be the same ones that are implicated in this because it's largely based on the underlying agricultural practices. So what's the research in terms of the human health effects of pesticides? Well, there are two major pathways that we know pesticides can potentially impact on health outcomes through. The first one is a very clear one. Pesticides are quite potent acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And so we actually test, in the field for acute exposure for farmers. We test that exposure by testing acetylcholinesterase activity. And so there are these point of care tests that you can administer and find out if a farmer has been exposed. And these are particularly for organophosphorus compounds. So a lot of insecticides like chlorpyrifos, but also glyphosate, as I keep mentioning, is also an organophosphorus compound. So by inhibiting acetylcholine or acetylcholinesterase, of course, there will be impacts on brain development and neurological function. This is why exposure for pregnant women and kids early in their development can have important impacts. And a lot of the research has actually been on early child development impacts of pesticide exposure. And it's one of the reasons why the EU is considering, EU, UK, and US are all considering bans on glyphosate. There have also been lots of studies amongst applicators of pesticides that have looked at the impact on Parkinson's and found pretty consistent effects of exposure to pesticides on that outcome. The second pathway is through endocrine disruption. This is a little bit harder to study because it's kind of, as with all studies of low dose exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, it's really hard to kind of identify the causal pathways there, but there have been, this is the pathway that they think pesticides seem to have an effect on cancer, particularly non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I'll talk about that in the next slide, but also in terms of reproductive function, especially male fertility, as well as obesity and diabetes, which are the outcomes that I'm particularly interested in studying. So kind of going back to that compound glyphosate and this cancer outcome, there's been some really interesting developments on this over the past couple of years because several cases, 4 in total, 3 that are completed and 1 that's still ongoing. There are several cases in which people in the US have actually sued the company Monsanto, which originally produced glyphosate, but that has since been bought by Bayer. They have sued these people all developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and attributed it to Roundup exposure and sued the company who makes it. And 3 of the 4 so far, the 3 that have finished, have won those lawsuits and have kind of had settlements with the company. What I think is particularly interesting, though, is if you follow these cases, just one quote from an article that was describing the cases, the evidence revealed in the trial, including internal Monsanto records, include discussions of ghostwriting scientific papers that assert the safety of its products and plans to discredit an international agency that declared the main ingredient in Roundup is a probable human carcinogen. So that international agency was IARC, of course, the WHO, the agency within the UN that kind of classifies different compounds as different levels of carcinogens. And they classified glyphosate a while back in the same category as tobacco. But basically, the records from these cases, it just completely resonates with the court cases against tobacco companies relating to lung cancer, decades ago. It's very similar in terms of the tactics that these companies have brought forward. And I think this is one of the reasons why this compound in particular is likely to be banned in the coming years. In fact, even Bayer has said that they are not planning to sell this product for domestic use. So from 2023. So in the US, you'll no longer be able to go on Amazon and buy Roundup for a couple bucks because it will no longer be allowed to use domestically. They will only sell it for agricultural uses. So and that's kind of the way that pesticide regulation has tended to work historically, where you can use it at home and then they find that there's some adverse health consequence, so they ban it for home use and only allow it in agriculture. And then the research tends to kind of stop there, although some people, including our work, which I'll talk about in just a minute, is trying to unpack what the consequences of agricultural and dietary exposure are. So just kind of transitioning a bit away from the health effects of pesticides and towards the flip side of that, which is if you eat organic food, which is produced without pesticides, what are the impacts on human health? So this is just another way to kind of look at it, similar to, studies that look at smokers who quit smoking and see what the health benefits of eliminating the exposure are. So multiple studies, relatively small randomized controlled trials, have shown that if you feed individuals organic food, and that can either be a whole diet approach, or even there was one study in Montana that just fed, in the US, that just fed pregnant women organic produce, so fresh fruit and veg, also saw a significant decline in urinary pesticide exposure. And that decline is quite immediate, actually, in terms of the dip in exposure levels when you go on an organic diet. Unfortunately, however, no study has kind of taken it a step further and looked at what the consequences of kind of sustaining an organic diet might be in terms of health outcomes. But these studies do pretty conclusively demonstrate that if you eat organic, you can reduce your exposure. A handful of studies have also just looked at organic food consumption. Epidemiological studies have looked at it and seen beneficial effects on health. One of the biggest ones, and what I would think is probably one of the least confounded studies, partly because the prevalence of organic food consumption is just so much more it's just so much more common in France compared to, say, the US or the UK. But this study in France has been following largely a cohort of women over time, over 30,000 participants, and they have the most comprehensive data on organic food intake of any cohort study that I've seen so far. They have a food frequency questionnaire, and for every food, they ask what proportion is organic. And then they classify individuals in the cohort as consuming what proportion of their food as organic. And in this particular study that I'm showing here, they found that those in the highest quintile of organic food, so that was about half of their food being organic, had a 35% lower risk of type 2 diabetes compared to those who practically had no food that was organic. And that was after adjustment for pretty much every measured confounder that they had, all the socio-demographic variables, diet-related variables in terms of, overall diet quality, energy intake, and other lifestyle-related variables. But of course, there's always the chance of residual confounding. But it does suggest that there's some independent effect of reducing your pesticide exposure on type 2 diabetes risk. So what is the status of organic in the UK? And this will kind of help transition to why we're doing this work in India. So organic farming in the UK has been steadily declining over the past 10 years. You can see those trends here overall and by country, but really it's across the board, the land under organic cultivation is going down. This is in contrast to other parts of the world, like the EU, for example, which has actually set a target to increase land under organic cultivation up to 25% by 2030, and has seen a steady increase, pretty slow but steady increase in land under organic cultivation over time. The UK has not set a target. A group of stakeholders in Scotland has submitted a proposal to the Scottish government to set a target of 25% in line with the EU. But no official targets exist in the UK as of yet. But in Andhra Pradesh, which is a state in South India, I'll show a map in a little bit. It's a state that's a little bit smaller in terms of population and cultivated land than the UK, but pretty comparable in size. They have set a target of 100% organic land by 2030. So it's really quite an unprecedented policy that's been adopted there. And it's really why we were very interested in this kind of opportunity to work with the government to study what are the population health effects of that transition. So I'm hoping this will work, but if it doesn't work, then I will just pull it up on my browser. I've got it loaded, but just check the time here. Yeah. I wanted to kind of share this video that the government put together with the UN that kind of gives you a flavor of what this program is all about. So I'm going to just try this and hopefully it works, but I'll keep an eye on the chat. So John, if you could just drop a message if the sound's not coming through on your end, that would be great. Oh. Sorry that you couldn't hear that, but she was speaking in Telugu. So I think glad that you were able to see the captions and at least to see the video as well, to have a flavor of what it looks like in this place in India where we're working. So we have conducted some pilot work in this state to try and understand in the context of, COVID, we were kind of planning to do this pilot in person, but adapted to phone interviews of farmers. And then when things opened up briefly, we were able to do some in-person interviews with pesticide retailers. But in this pilot, we were really kind of interested in what's been the impact on pesticide use in particular. So we did these farmer surveys with about 700 conventional farmers and 150 APCNF farmers, and I'll just present the farmer survey results today. So what we found was that, and you can see that here in terms of reductions in chemical use. So we asked about currently using changes in both fertilizer and pesticide use over the past 4 years. And we compared the conventional farmers to the organic farmers who are practicing this program that the government is training farmers in. And we found huge reductions in the use of pesticides. So you can see that in India, almost all farmers, 99% of them that we surveyed, the conventional farmers, used pesticides in agriculture. And that dropped to about 50% amongst the APCNF farmers. So whilst it's meant to be, the program is meant to be complete elimination, there is still some use of pesticides. But the farmers who are using pesticides are using it on separate plots of land. So they'll take a small portion of their land, and that will be the organic portion, and then the rest of their plot is where they're using the pesticides. So because we're interested in the health of the farmers, we're concerned about any pesticide use on any field. So there is some use, but it's a very substantial reduction. And they're also more likely to report a decrease in the use of both fertilizer and pesticides over the past 4 years, and less likely to report an increase in pesticides, though there still is some large proportion reporting an increase. We couldn't really get to the bottom of this. We actually got some data on pest outbreaks from the government at the district level, and didn't see any particular uptick in pest outbreaks that would explain that. Something to explore further beyond this pilot. And we saw huge reductions in expenditures, just kind of another way to look at their use of pesticides and synthetic fertilizer, a very large reduction down to zero mean expenditures on pesticides amongst the organic farmers. So really, really promising results in terms of this program at the very early stages in a relatively small pilot, showing promising results with reductions in pesticide use. So the study that Peter and I are working together with the government in AP on is called BLOOM, so Co-Benefits of Large-Scale Organic Farming on Human Health. And our objective is really to provide some of the most rigorous scientific evidence to date regarding the potential health benefits of organic. And the study design is a cluster randomized controlled evaluation. So we're working with the government. We have an MOU with the government to kind of allow us in two of the 13 districts in AP to randomize the order in which the clusters receive the government program. And because, again, they're not planning to fully transition until 2030, they were willing to give us some of the fresh clusters that they hadn't implemented the program in before, and to randomize some of them to receive it immediately and some of them to receive it after 2 years. So the study is located in Andhra Pradesh. It's a state in South India shown on this map. And as I mentioned, we're working in 2 districts, the orange one, Kurnool, and the green one, Vizag, which is a kind of a coastal area, and Kurnool is a much drier area. So we'll have 2 really different agroecological zones. I won't go through the details of this, but just a kind of a classic flow chart of our participants. Just to say that we are going to be randomizing 40 clusters in each district, have to get the program immediately and have to get it after 2 years. And within each of the clusters, we're going to be randomizing 34 farming households. We're kind of assuming that about 18% of these won't be eligible. So we'll ultimately do an assessment in about 2,200, a little over that at baseline, and follow them up over 24 months. In terms of the intervention itself, the video really captured this. It's an organic farming program known as APCNF, and it's implemented by an organization known as RYSS, which is a specific organization within the government of AP that was set up to oversee this program. And in terms of what they're actually training farmers on, the first and foremost is not having any synthetic chemical input, so no pesticides and no synthetic fertilizer. And also this emphasis on integrating cow urine and dung into the soils in order to improve the nitrogen content of soils naturally. 365-day cover crops, again, to kind of preserve the quality of the soil and water retention within the soils. But they're also looking at things like promoting crop diversity, as well as kitchen gardens and the use of indigenous seeds. In terms of who's actually implementing the program, there are many different people involved in it. Primarily, the people who are paid by the government are these what are called community resource persons, or CRPs. So they're kind of the first people who have been trained, and it's sort of a train the trainer approach. So they in turn are training the SHGs, the women self-help groups, and these are groups within the actual community who are they have kind of champion farmers within them. Their farmer to farmer learning is happening at the SHG level. And so they're kind of where a lot of the farmers will go to the SHGs who have been trained by the CRPs to learn about the practices and to troubleshoot, for example, if there is some sort of pest outbreak. Our primary outcomes for the study are urinary pesticide metabolites, and we're going to be measuring those after just 1 year of following these practices, as well as dietary diversity. These are things that we think will be quite sensitive to even partial adoption of organic farming. As I mentioned, or if you feed someone organic foods, you see an immediate and quite significant impact on urinary pesticide exposure. So we anticipate that with 50% or more pesticide reduction, you'll see in terms of pesticide use, you'll see subsequently a pretty big reduction in urinary pesticides. We have a lot of secondary outcomes. Here I'm just listing the different measurements that we're doing, but we'll be measuring both on the adult men and women in the household and children under the age of 3 in the household. So we'll have all sorts of measurements in terms of metabolic function, kidney function, respiratory symptoms, which are common for acute exposure. We're storing samples and hoping to look at markers of immune function. We're measuring anemia. And then, of course, many survey-based measurements, including women's empowerment. And we're also doing child development, which is exposure that we're quite interested in because organophosphates are quite commonly used in this area. And there's, as I mentioned again, I mentioned before, the acetylcholinesterase inhibition. So we think that will be quite an important pathway and outcome to look at over the longer term. So that's it for today. I'm sorry I ran a little bit over, but a couple concluding remarks here. I'm happy to share my slides if you want. We've got a link here that you can go to if you'd like to learn more. We're just starting our baseline data collection this spring. So we had a couple of delays due to COVID and contracting related issues. So finally, contracts are all set up and we're ready to go as soon as the agricultural season starts. So stay tuned for more results over the next couple of years. But thanks so much for letting me present kind of our early results and the study design so that you have a flavor of what we're working on. And I'm happy to take questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lindsay. That was such a fantastic and interesting talk. This is really interesting, and I was really surprised about which fruits and which foods had the most pesticides and the big six. I thought that was really insightful, especially thinking about the random control trials as well, and just thinking about potential inequalities in those who can afford and have access to organic food.
Yep.
And how that could potentially be another impact on inequalities and potential health outcomes.
Yeah.
But I did have a couple of questions, but we've actually got a few that have been asked by the attendees, so I'll go straight to them, which are in the Q&A box if you want to see them, but I will read them out so everybody else can hear. So somebody's asked, it's my understanding that at least some organic vegetables are sprayed with organically derived chemicals, and do these have similar adverse human health effects?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. So there was a study that was just published that's quite similar to what we did in India that looked at pesticide use amongst organic farmers. And they found about 30% of organic farmers use naturally derived pesticides. So it is definitely quite common, and there are many naturally derived pesticides that are approved for use, including a lot of the neem-based pesticides, which you saw the woman in the video preparing. No, there have not been, there have been very few studies on the synthetic pesticides. There have been even fewer on, high concentration exposures to these naturally occurring insecticides either. And so we don't really know. Some synthetic chemicals like pyrethroids the underlying chemistry is based on naturally occurring compounds. So pyrethroids are kind of mimics of chrysanthem flowers, for example, which I don't know what you call them here, mums, or maybe you call them chrysanthemums, but they're kind of like a fall flower that you see quite commonly, similar to marigolds, the annual. And and studies have shown that a handful of studies have shown adverse health consequences of pyrethroids, kind of the synthetic equivalent of the chrysanthem flower. So I don't think it would be very surprising, though I think probably less, they're less potent certainly than the synthetically derived ones. I didn't talk about pesticide suicide, but it's actually the compounds that are currently used as insecticides are very, very potent. And I don't think that they're, the naturally occurring things are as potent as those compounds. So perhaps less of a health effect, but I wouldn't rule it out per se.
Thanks, Lindsay. So there's a question from Harry at the top, who said thanks for an insightful talk, and he was wondering on your thoughts about policies at the national level aiming to encourage seasonal diets, which I'm guessing is moving away from this food just being available to us all the time, which is likely to be more organic in a sustainable way, and which minimizes those fresh fruit imports from abroad. So do you have any evidence of policies around that sort of strategy, which is how it used to be? People talk about the old days.
So I've never seen no one has a policy like that I'm aware of, but the testing does suggest that, well, in the US, I'm not as familiar with the UK, but US testing of residues suggests that imported food is more than twice as likely to be above the maximum residue limit as domestic food. So you're absolutely right that at least in the context in which we live in the US and UK, buying domestically produced things is likely to be, but it depends on where you're importing from. So the EU is, it's still, we're not really sure what's going to happen with Brexit, but it's quite possible that the UK will adopt less strict regulations when it comes to the use of pesticides as compared to the EU. And so if you're importing most of your food from the EU, that may not be true actually. So we kind of have to wait and see. In the US, a lot of the imports are coming from Central America, where there are not as strict regulations. So it does depend a little bit on where those food products are coming from. So certainly check the label. But yeah, it's a really good question. There's another question around, there's a lot of talk in sustainable food systems, particularly in Scotland, around indoor farming. So, we're building big indoor farms, and they're, whether or not those might be a way to have local produce year-round in a place like Scotland. But it's also unclear the use of pesticides in those contexts, because if you get an aphid outbreak in indoor, fresh veg farm, you're definitely people will be spraying in there too. So it may not actually reduce exposure. So in fact, some people are saying it may increase exposure. So I think there are a lot of unknowns and complications between the two, but yeah. So I don't think I answered that question very well, but hope I provided a little bit of insight.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting answer. And linked to that, I wondered, were there any discussions during COP that have sort of advised nations about sustainable farming, because it's obviously having a huge impact on health and the climate. And I wonder if you were aware of anything around that.
Yeah, so there definitely was. There wasn't very much in terms of organics. We had a little event that was kind of about scaling up organics. The big talks were around deforestation, which is mostly related to livestock production systems, which do play a role in organic production as well, as a source of biomass for fertilizing fields. But there certainly weren't any very high level discussions on pesticide use, probably because biodiversity is still kind of a separate topic from climate change. In a lot of circles, they're starting to come together, but COP was not really talking very much about biodiversity, which is really the major environmental impact of the widespread use of pesticides. So, yeah.
There were a couple of questions about more linked to the study that you presented. And Mary Kate asked, how likely is it that neighbours of the households, so people who are neighbouring to the people involved in your intervention, will already start those practices before joining the programme itself? That's maybe how you'll account for that in your study design.
Yeah. So we're randomizing at the cluster level. So that all of the households, the government program is kind of at a village, or depending on the size of the village, sometimes it's a cluster of 2 or 3 villages. Those clusters of households are kind of all getting the program at the same time, because organic tends to work better if a lot of people in the same area adopt it. Because if you're the only person not spraying pesticides and all the people next to you are spraying them, all the bugs are going to go onto your land. So it works much better if everyone in that kind of cluster adopts it at the same time. So our biggest concern would be contamination between these clusters of households, rather than kind of household to household in the same cluster. We're hoping actually that all of the households in the intervention clusters will take it up. In terms of cluster to cluster contamination, the clusters are pretty spread apart, and we haven't heard much about contamination in terms of geographic contamination. The biggest thing now is YouTube. So with COVID, a lot of farmers are actually just going on YouTube, and the government has actually uploaded a bunch of videos on YouTube. And even in that pilot survey I mentioned, about 10% of farmers learned about APCNF by watching YouTube videos, and we think that number will continue to increase. So we're kind of grappling with new forms of contamination. So certainly if anyone has any tips on that sort of thing, please do pass them on.
Yeah, wow, that is a new input, and you wonder about misinformation, but at least the government are putting on the information, so hopefully they're being provided, all the farms are being provided with good information. Also linked to your sort of study design, Peter's asked if you could say a little bit more about the economic measures that will be collected. So he's just mentioned the effects on income might be a big factor in sustaining compliance.
Yep, definitely. So we are collecting income, and it was actually when we first started talking about the program was one of the primary, we were exploring it as a primary outcome. And we ultimately decided, because our goal was really around explicitly the health effects, to stick with the things that were immediate, health related outcomes. And it's now a secondary. But we are really interested in that, and we'll be doing comprehensive assessments of both household income, but also household expenditures, because the bottom line of the household will change a lot if they're not buying synthetic chemicals, which are a major expenditure of farmers that leads to the debt. So if you cut out that expenditure, even if income is the same, they're going to come out at the end of the day in better economic shape because they don't have those additional expenditures. So we'll be measuring both the ins and outs of household economics. Yep.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question from Danny White, and he said, in the UK, I think low-till conservation agriculture is intended to maximize carbon sequestration involving massive herbicide use. How do you see the pros and cons of mitigating climate change versus reducing synthetic chemicals in the environment? A tough one there.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, but these things really go hand in hand. So actually, one of the components of the program in India is low tillage, and I think almost all farmers are going towards low till. But that really also relates to the soil microbiome. So if you do low till and then you spray it with herbicides, you're still having negative impacts on the underlying soil microbiome, which we know is influenced by the use of these synthetic chemicals. So I think that most organic farmers that I've worked with here in Scotland, which have mostly been wheat farmers, organic wheat farmers, they are doing low till or no till and are organic, but they have new forms of harvesting. I'm not an agricultural scientist or engineer, which is, I guess, who would really be making this technology, but they have new, harvesters that are actually really good at separating out the wheat from the weeds through multiple different sieving contraptions in the harvester. And so this has helped not only reduce herbicide use on these fields, but it also enables them to grow multiple crops. So the wheat they're growing organically is quite tall, like more heritage wheats. It's not short like the Green Revolution wheats. So it's very tall wheat, and they're able to grow, for example, clover in the same field, so that the wheat is kind of above that, and they can harvest both of them together. So there are a lot of innovations, I think, in harvesting that are kind of helping maximize both the reduction in chemicals and also carbon sequestration.
Fantastic. It's just, I realize we're approaching 1 o'clock, but we've probably got time for one more question. And just to say, we normally get a few questions, but we've had so many, which I think just shows how engaging and interesting the talk was. So thank you. And are people okay to contact you directly afterwards?
Yes, of course. Let me just throw my email in here so it's easy to find.
Especially there's some quite specific questions that I imagine you'll have great discussion afterwards. So I'll just finish by asking Felicity's question, where she asked, if you know, are there any studies going on in the UK to look at children's exposure to pesticides, maybe through the diet and neurodevelopment?
I wish that I could say yes, but unfortunately, the current UK government stance on pesticides is that the levels on food, on the residues that they're testing on food, are not of public health concern. So there's not currently, as far as I'm aware, any studies either in terms of monitoring exposure. So for example, in the US and in the EU, there are nationally representative samples that measure annually measure exposure to pesticides in the population. The UK government stance is that that's not required because they do residue testing and the levels are not high enough to be toxic for human health. So I'm not aware of any studies that are going on here, but there have been several studies in the EU and in the US, and I'd be happy to share information about those studies if that would be of interest. There's actually a meta-analysis that's been done on that, so I'm happy to share that.
That's really interesting. It sounds like there is a gap, especially exploring this in the UK and wider.
Yeah. First step will just be measuring exposure. So we have some idea of what people in the UK, are exposed to, rather than just kind of individual crops.
Yeah. Well, we're just coming up to 2 o'clock. Sorry, I said 1 o'clock before. We're way past 1. But I just want to say thank you so much, Lindsay. That was a really interesting, fascinating talk. Really insightful. Thanks for your time. And I'm sure quite a few people will be in touch, because this has been one of the best to chair, because so many people have asked and been engaged. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks so much for your interest, everyone, and hope to be back in a couple of years with some exciting results from our trial.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, and good luck with the rest of the trial. See you
Thanks
soon.
so much. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Bye.